Antonia, do you want to say anything? You're our career lead. Do you want to say hi to the students before we start? Yes, okay. Where are you? There you are. I'm not sure. Antonia, can you hear us? Do you want to, maybe I'm just putting you on it. Maybe you just say something at the end. That would be helpful too, maybe. I think, and then let me maybe, let's do it like that. And you talk maybe to unmute a new video. Okay. Okay, you can, I don't know, like, I'll let you decide. Sorry for that confusion. Okay, if you want to unmute yourself, you can easily do that. Or if you want to start your video, you can do it. No, you can unmute yourself. You can only do it yourself.
Oh, okay. Hello, everybody. I tried earlier, that didn't work. But yes, just to say that both Andreas and I work together to support you with careers inquiries, and we're seeing lots of students online for appointments at the moment. So don't hesitate if you'd like to discuss something. Short appointments, 20 minutes, long appointments, 40 minutes. Book online at cityac.uk/careers via the Careers Hub portal. That's it, really.
Fantastic. I think I would love to hear at the end, Antonia, if you, or maybe we have like several stops and you can tell me whether you disagree with some of the things I say. I think it's really important. I think one of the tricky things about having a career with a psychology degree is that there's so much diversity. You can do so many things, which is great, but also can be kind of somewhat like anxiety inducing. Where should I start? How should I start? I'm trying today to kind of give you a little bit an overview and a general direction. Let me start my slides, share my screen, and then we can talk a little bit more about the content. I think I have 3 stops planned. So I will have a longer section at the beginning, and then a Q&A, then a somewhat shorter section, and then a Q&A, and then a really short section, and then a Q&A. And so if you have any questions, just try to hold them till then. I think I'm terribly easily distracted. So if you put something in a chat, I might just read it and get completely lost. So maybe you can kind of wait till the questions, till we have the Q&A. I think that would be great. So I'm just kind of closing the chat so I don't get too confused. Okay, so what do I want to do? And maybe I should have started with the next slide, but let me give you a quick overview and thereafter tell you for whom maybe the session is and for whom maybe you already know everything that's in that session. And maybe you can then decide to not attend any further. But I just want to give you a little bit an idea of what we're doing. We're focusing mainly on the kind of 3 areas that you can have a career in with a psychology degree. Obviously, there are other jobs out there where you don't even need a degree, right? If you want to become, I don't know, if you work at Tesco's, you do not need a psychology degree. I only talk about basically or mostly about careers that are related to psychology. I will talk a little bit about at the end about what I call the other. So in my mind, works for me the best. I have the 3 sections that I basically section all the careers you can do with a psychology degree. And one is somehow related to mental health. One is somehow related to well-being. And the term is not great. And then we have other and others. And I will talk all about all of these 3 and what you need to do and how you get there today. I will shortly thereafter also talk a little bit about what I call the 3 pillars. If you want to have a career, a graduate career, if you want to get a job that basically pays you according to your degree, pays you well, and you have an interesting job, then you need to kind of fulfill these 3 pillars. I come back at the end, not too long, and one of them is academic, one is research, and one is work or work experience, and I will talk about this briefly at the end, and then I will kind of make a little bit of a passionate appeal to you to kind of consider these 3 ingredients. ingredients. And I would just shortly talk about this because this is a little bit more fluffy and less fact focused. But I think that in order to have a successful career, you should think about 3 ingredients, and I call them ambition, passion, and experience. And I will talk shortly about this at the end. And as I said, I think I will have we will have 3 Q&As in between these major sections, so it doesn't get too boring and you don't have to listen too much to me. All right, let's get going. I think, for whom is this? This is like just something I want to say. So I will lay out basically all the different types of careers you can have with a psychology degree and how to get there. I will talk about the BPS accredited and the non-BPS accredited career paths. I will talk about what you need to do, what qualifications you need to have. And I will also talk a little bit more about these kind of like different perspectives on these careers. This will not replace, obviously, any of the talks that are coming up, right? Next week, for instance, we're talking about how to become a clinical psychologist. Amanda, amazing speaker, will talk at length about how to become a clinical psychologist. I just want to basically show you the building blocks and kind of show you a little bit how to think about it. It's also really important, I think, and I said that in the beginning when I introduced Antonia, to double check. I mean, I'm an academic, right? I know kind of a lot about employability because I organize for a while now events and listen to the speakers. I research and read about it. But in the end of the day, I think you will often or at times hear different kind of opinions about what you should or should not do, right? And I think it's really important that you kind of have a framework to go into. And for instance, next week when Amanda comes, you can ask her, do you really think that you do not need a master's degree if you want to become a clinical psychologist? And then you can check whether I'm telling you the truth or not. Okay. So I think it's basically the other thing I want to say. Introduction doesn't mean that this is only for year 1 or only for year 2 or year 3. Think about it like if you are in year 3 and you have not done anything for your career, perfectly fine. You're at the right spot. You can't really, in order to have a career, you can't really skip any steps. You always have to, everyone in year 1, year 2, year 3 has to kind of start at the same, at the same step. You have to start with the foundation and then build from there. And I'll tell you a little bit about what the foundations are. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so let's talk about the 3 areas, and then we will have kind of like a better feeling for each of these different jobs. So the first one is kind of easy to characterize, and this is a domain that largely deals each career within there, each job within there deals with some type of mental health, okay? I think you can also somehow characterize it with, like if you think about a human and whether they're happy or unhappy, if they have a mental issue, and you say like, okay, if you have some mental health issues, there's some deficit, something that needs to be fixing. Obviously, that's not the right term. That is not, if I'm depressed, I don't need fixing. That's not the way to think about it. But think about this as an area where there's something you want to basically help people to overcome. There's something, a deficit you want to help them to overcome. And this is all the classical areas like you can think of: clinical psychology, counseling psychology, etc. And I will talk about this at length in a minute. Then there's another that I think often as kind of well-being or flourishing. Here, you are more interested in helping people to flourish. They might, for instance, be athletes. They might be people who work in a company, and you want them to be even more productive, even more happier. There's nothing in terms of mental health or anything that they need addressing, but you want to help them flourish. You want to help the organization flourish. So there's a whole package there that is more centered around well-being and flourishing. I think the term doesn't fit perfectly well, and I'm still kind of trying to find the perfect, but a lot of the careers in this area have something in common. And then I think we have the most difficult one, which is the other. This is basically where you finish your bachelor degree in psychology and you kind of come to realization, you know what, I really hate psychology. I don't want to do anything with psychology. Fair enough. I think that's unfortunate, but that might happen, right? You feel like, okay, maybe you just feel like, okay, this was interesting, but I want to do something very different. So here we are trying to kind of open up career options that capitalize on the fact that you have a degree, so that doesn't get to waste, kind of graduate careers that kind of help, and where there's a nice fit between the psychology degree and the career, but they don't have anything per se to do with psychology. Okay. So that's the other. And I mean, as you can imagine, there are many, many different ones, and they have often not much in common. So other is a little bit the smorgasbord collection that you will find there in terms of careers. Okay, let's look at mental health. So mental health, right, can be kind of characterized in basically among contexts. So you can have mental health issues and encounter people with mental health issues in different contexts, right? And that kind of structures the way you should think about the BPS accredited. The BPS is the British Psychological Society, which basically accredits, says that's a real job, these 4 types of like careers. So I think most of you have heard of this, is clinical psychology. So if you become a clinical psychologist, you mainly work, or you work within the NHS. Your context is the NHS, and within that context, you encounter mental health issues. So sometimes when I explain my students how to think about it, I say, oh, imagine I would have an imaginary son, and let's call him Benny. And Benny has like an acute episode of schizophrenia. Okay, so he would go to an hospital and need urgent help. So Benny would encounter now a clinical psychologist who would try to help him. Okay, it's within the classic NHS setting, within a hospital, and here he gets help. Okay, so it's acute and he needs help. He meets the effort maybe also of a psychiatrist, so somebody who studied medicine to help him. Okay, now imagine that Benny then leaves. Okay, he's kind of stabilized, he leaves the hospital and comes back to live with me at home, but maybe still needs outside the NHS counseling, or I need counseling to kind of help Benny, my imaginary son, better to cope with his schizophrenia. This is when you come into contact with counseling psychology. We have 2 events, one on how to become a clinical psychologist and one on how to become a counseling psychologist. In essence, every job you do as a clinical psychologist, you can also do as a counseling psychologist, okay? There are differences that I will allude to in 2 or 3 minutes between these, but there's a huge overlap, okay? So you can be a counseling psychologist and work within the NHS, but more often than not, you would not work within the NHS, but you would work outside. But both of you, both of a clinical psychologist and counseling psychologist, are kind of really focused on helping people in crisis in their life. Then let's say Benny comes out, he comes back to me, he's trying to get back on, like getting his feet back on the ground. Let me just move this. And so he goes back to school. Okay. Now here he might struggle because he has schizophrenia, and his issues might interfere with his school performance. He might be difficult to deal with as a student. The teachers might have questions about how they best can help Benny. And this is when you contact an educational psychologist. Educational psychologists have a huge emphasis, not just on mental health, but especially on learning disabilities. So if you're interested in learning disabilities, ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and so forth, that's more or less the educational psychologist. So the educational psychologist deals with mental health and learning disabilities within a school setting. The context is the school. Clinical psychologists also deal with learning disabilities, or counseling psychologists the same way, but in different settings, okay? Educational psychologists, traditionally, they're trying to kind of extend that work in schools with children who are 18 and younger, or maybe teenagers. I think my daughter, who is 10, would not be happy to be called a child. The last one is forensic psychology. Here you basically deal with mental health issues within the prison system, within the criminal system, okay? Forensic psychology, as you will see, is a little bit of an outlier. Often here, the focus is not to help people, but to assess the risk they pose to others and society in large. So it's often not to kind of help them to overcome, unfortunately, their mental health issues, but basically helping society to deal with the danger they pose, or to assess whether they possess any danger to us and society at large. So as you can see, all of them are mental health, And all of them are in a different context. There's one I did not talk about yet. This is a neuropsychologist. I think this is something maybe you might be interested in. A neuropsychologist is basically somebody who deals with brain trauma. So it's more closer to, if you're in a clinical field, if you think about neurology. So if somebody, for instance, let's imagine Benny, my imaginary son, decides in one of his fits to kind of take a car, has a bad car accident, his brain is damaged. Now he would see a neuropsychologist. I think Trudy, the head of our department, she's a neuropsychologist and she can tell us more about this. And hopefully we get her on one of these talks soon. But a neuropsychologist, in order to become a neuropsychologist, you have to be either a clinical psychologist, a counseling psychologist, an educational psychologist, or a forensic psychologist. So this is far, far, far down the line, and I think you don't have to worry about. And if you're interested in neuropsychology, Amanda, who's talking next week, she is a clinical psychologist who focuses largely on neuropsychology. She doesn't have the qualification to be officially called a neuropsychologist, but she basically does the work of a neuropsychologist. Just to confuse you a little bit more. But let's focus on the 4 on the bottom, just to kind of say, okay, let's say you are interested in becoming one of these, okay? How do you do that? Let me kind of outline the principles of clinical psychologists, how to become a clinical psychologist, because all of these 4 are basically the same. There's forensic is a little bit different, but you basically have to have a bachelor degree in psychology. Here it is important that your degree is BPS accredited. That should not concern you because our degree is BPS accredited, so you don't have to worry about this at all, okay? So let's say you have your degree, and this is the idealized version of how you become a clinical psychologist. You leave, and then next thing you have to do, you have to have 1 year of work experience with your degree. And I talk about the work experience as an example in a second longer, what type of work experience. So you basically, you leave your degree and then you have 1 year of work experience. Then you do a doctorate. One of the questions I often get is, what is a doctorate? I don't feel like, and so when you finish your doctorate, you become a doctor and thereby a clinical psychologist. So what is a doctorate? A doctorate is basically, the way I describe it, is a 3-year part-time master's. I'm not sure if people would agree with this definition, but if you do a doctorate in clinical psychology, you would work 3 days a week or sometimes 4 days a week in a hospital or in an NHS setting. And then 1 or 2 days you would come back to university and study. It makes it a doctorate because at the end you have to have a full dissertation. You have to have a full independent piece of research. Okay, so you basically learn the trade. You would, for instance, 3 days a week work in a pediatric psychiatry, part of that team. And then you would, for 2 days, come back to the university and you would learn about the theories that guide your practice. Okay, and at some point you would start to do your own research, your own research project. And so this is why I call it a master. Just as you have at the end of a master, have a master dissertation, you need to be a little bit like a bigger project. That would be then your dissertation for the doctorate. And then you are a doctor. So Dr. Amanda Mwale, our speaker next week, if you have more questions how it is to be on a doctorate. The good thing about clinical psychology is that the doctorate is paid. You get well paid for doing this. So once you're in a doctorate, you have a secure career unless you drop out, unless you don't finish the doctorate. The NHS is paying for it. It's paying well for it. You get a good amount of money. And once you're a clinical psychologist, you don't have to worry about ever finding employment. There's tons of jobs out there. So this is, once you're in a doctorate, it's stressful and it's intense, but it's also, you don't have to worry about your career prospects anymore. So now there's basically, if you look at counseling psychology, it's the same setup, the same thing as beforehand. only now you have to pay for your doctorate. Okay. I often call the counseling a little bit like the kind of like the hippie child of clinical psychology. So if you do your doctorate in counseling psychology, City actually has an excellent counseling doctorate. Then you have much more freedom. You can kind of decide on things you want to do, theories, kind of ideas, schools, settings that you want to follow. So you have much more control over that, but that comes at your own expense. You have to pay for it. So I think it's about 30 to 50,000 for 3 years. The same is true as a clinical psychologist. Once you finished your doctorate and you earn a little bit of money during your doctorate, then you have a good life. I think if you have a degree as a counseling psychologist, you don't have to worry about finding a job or getting paid and so forth. We will have in the second half a talk by Jessica, and she will talk about, she's a counseling psychologist who teaches counseling psychology, introduction to counseling psychology also in our third year, and she will talk about how to become a counseling psychologist. If you kind of Google it online, if you watch YouTube videos, they're long videos where they try to explain what the difference between counseling and clinical is, and often it just comes back to setting and freedom. And also importantly, I think for you, at least it would be for me, you have to pay for your doctorate unless instead of getting paid for it. Educational psychology, same setup. You do your degree, you need some work experience, you do your doctorate. Here, educational psychology, as of today, there's always rumors that this will change, but as of today, you get paid too. And then you become an educational psychologist, and the same is true. You will have a job. Educational psychologists are very sought after, and there's a lot actually happening in the private sector where you can work as a private person, as an educational psychology for private companies, and there's much more money even to make. But even if you work for a school, the school system, for a district, etc., then you will earn really nicely, and you don't have to worry about employment. We will have, I think, in the week 7, we have somebody who would talk about how to become an educational psychologist. So we will have that covered too. Okay, now we come to the little slightly weird bit, and that's forensic psychology. As a forensic psychologist, you have to do a master's and a doctorate, and you have to pay for both of these. Okay, so it seems somewhat unfair. And to be frank about it, I mean, the forensic psychology is much smaller. So clinical psychology is big, counseling psychology is big, educational psychology is a little bit smaller, and forensic psychology is very small. And you have to kind of endure a long path in order to become a forensic psychologist. I think it's really important that you early on experience how it is to be within the prison system, if this is something for you or not. I'll come back to that in a second when I talk about work experience. But once you have your doctorate, you did your master, you did your doctorate, you paid plenty, it's a very lucrative career if you're only concerned about money, and you can make a lot of money in this area. And forensic psychologists are really sought after because it's a really long way to get there. One thing I'm not talking about, there are other kind of alternative routes to become a counseling and a forensic psychologist, which don't really apply to any of you guys. But for instance, if I would try to become a counseling psychologist, I could use some of my research experience and so forth of my career and apply that and get different ways to become a counseling or forensic psychologist. But that doesn't really apply to you guys, and you shouldn't worry about that. So this is kind of like the idealized path to all of these, right? Let me talk a little bit about work experience, okay? So in a perfect world, what you would do is you would finish your psychology degree if you want to become a clinical psychologist. You finish your bachelor degree, and then you become an assistant psychologist, okay? So this is basically kind of like considered, perceived the best stepping stone between your bachelor degree and your doctorate, okay? So why is this so? Because you're basically doing a lot of the things already within the NHS that you would do as a clinical psychologist. So you have the experience, And it's also great for you because it's paid very well. But as you can imagine, it's very competitive, and there are not that many assistant psychology jobs out there. So there are many other alternatives, and we will talk about these alternatives in our upcoming seminars. So, for instance, one of the things you can do when you finish your clinical, when you finish your bachelor degrees, you can become a well-being practitioner. Sounds a little bit lame. I always thought that's not a great name, but a well-being practitioner is actually something really cool. Sometimes it's also called low-intensity therapist. So what does a well-being practitioner do? It's basically you would finish your degree here at City, and I think in London the only university who offers it is you go to UCL and you apply to get your well-being practitioner certificate. The good thing about this is you get paid to do this. And once you have finished this, you don't have to become a clinical psychologist. You can say, and many do that, they don't want to become then a clinical psychologist. They want to stay and work as well-being practitioners. You earn good money. It's an interesting job. You often work in teams with clinical psychologists. You would have a little bit less intense cases as a clinical psychologist. So you wouldn't maybe see Benny, my hypothetical psychotic son, when he's at the height of his psychosis, but if he needs some kind of psychoeducation, so learn about his mental health and how he can prevent it and early signs, this would be something, relaxation methods and so forth. Often you work with depression and anxiety patients. So this is a really great way. And we have, I can't remember, in week 8, Shah Alam comes and he talks about it because he basically left university and said, like, I don't want to pay for anything. I want to do things and get paid for that because now I have my degree. And he became a well-being practitioner, and then he became a cognitive therapist. So just as well-being practitioner is a 1-year certificate that qualifies you to work as a well-being practitioner, you can then go on and become a cognitive therapist, which is often also called high-intensity therapist. Okay, and here basically you get a little bit more intense cases than your work is a little bit more advanced. It's a great job. I think you earn between 40 and 50,000, and you have a great career. So Shah Alam did that. He basically became a well-being practitioner. Then somebody suggested, hey, if you want to step up a little bit, why don't you become a cognitive therapist or high-intensity therapist? So he did this. And then at some point, somebody approached him and said, like, hey, now you have everything. Why don't you try to apply for the doctorate? And then he applied for a doctorate. So he basically was paid and working all the time after his university degree. And I think that's a really good thing to consider. Another one is like mental health care worker. Mental health care worker is another really good job that prepares you to get work experience. Support worker, you work in the NHS. It's an intense job, but it's a really great way to get work experience before getting into a doctorate or applying for these doctorates. Or then maybe you feel like, well, this is, if I do a year of mental health care worker, then I become an assistant psychologist or a well-being practitioner. So all I'm trying to say here is that there are many ways to roam. Okay. And don't think of it as like, oh, I have to do this and then this. And we will have some of our former students this year talking about this, how kind of, crooked a little bit the actuality is, or the actual path to these careers, and not as a straightforward way. Okay. Let me I think this is, yes, I see 2 questions in the chat. I hope it's not something like we can't hear you. Basically, the thing is, in the beginning, I said that in terms of where do you start, right? And I think the foundation to get to the next step to get any of these jobs, mental health care worker, well-being practitioner, cognitive therapist, assistant psychologist, that then qualify you to get, if you want to do your doctorate, you need to have some kind of volunteering experience, okay? So ideally, is if you're in year 1, year 2, or 3, you start during your degree to collect this volunteering experience. If you haven't done it and you feel like, oh my God, year 3 is too intense, I can't start volunteering now, then you have to do it after you finish your degree. There's no real way around this. You have to gather some kind of work experience to then get to the better work experience. As weird as this might sound, but it's really important that you, during the degree or after the degree, you have to build often like 1 or 2 or 3 different types of volunteering activities that then give you the chance to get like to the jobs I just outlined, just as a well-being practitioner or high intensity therapist, or what was the third? Yeah, mental support worker and so forth. Okay, let me kind of stop here and see what the questions are. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Oh, okay. So Antonia says like, yes, I think, okay, Antonia says you don't need to have a doctorate. We come back to that. I'm pretty sure you need a doctorate to become a forensic psychologist. But I think I have this really ugly BPS slide overview. But yes, so I think it's really important to also listen. Maybe there's some things I'm getting wrong. Always yes. And Shah Alam is a city grad. I think it's all from Antonia. Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay. Oh, here's the first question. So what's the difference between a doctorate and a PhD? And do you get your doctor title after completing a doctorate? Yes. So this is something, okay, I'll answer all of these questions. So this is a great question. And I think for me, this was really puzzling because this is something that's very specific to the UK. So I have a PhD, which I call in my mind, but don't tell anyone, a proper doctor. Okay, so I never did any, so if you think about the doctorate, right, as I described it to you, so basically you would work 3 days in a clinical setting. You would work with patients, you would work with your team, you would start already delivering a therapy as on your doctorate, and then for only 2 days, you would get lectures, and then you have to do a little bit of research, okay? All I did during my PhD was research. I didn't get any, I was done with being lectured to, and I was just doing my independent research. And that's how I got my doctor. I can't do anything within the NHS. If you have any mental health issues, I can't help you in any shape or form. I have no qualifications for that. If you have problems with your data or something like that, then I'm your guy. Okay, so this is the difference. So if you do a PhD, this is solely focused on having a career within academia. And we come actually to that in a second. If you have a doctorate, you can call yourself thereafter a doctor. You don't have a PhD, but you have a doctor. This doesn't help you to get into university. So having a doctorate doctor is really hard to then go and teach at the university, because we think that this doesn't qualify you enough to be an expert in a certain field in terms of teaching it, for instance, to you guys, or to do research in that area. But this is, that's a very black and white characterization. There's some people who have a doctorate and work at universities. But I think anyone who teaches you on the undergrad, I have to kind of think about it, has a proper PhD. I would have to think about if there is somebody who doesn't, okay? So then I think, okay, fantastic. Oh gosh, so many questions. Okay, let me, so I think the person who asked it, if you can just, I think that's the difference between doctorate and a PhD. I think a PhD is basically, you want to stay at a university and you don't want to see any patients or clients or anything like that. You just want to do research. That's what I do. And the doctorate is, you basically do not want to go to the university, but you want to work within the NHS or within the school system, or you want to have your own practice and will help people. Okay, so then the next question is the well-being practitioner postgrad at UCL funded? Yes, you receive good salary, really good. It's super competitive, but don't get, we talk about this, how to think about competition. Yes, it's funded. You get a salary. You get a good salary as if you're interested in that. I think in week 8, I have to look at it. I'm not sure. Let me just kind of click on my Notion page because I saw. Okay, so week 9, we have mental health jobs that you haven't heard of. And this is where Shah comes and talks about this. Okay, so yes, you get paid as a well-being practitioner. So that's good. And I think here in London, Antonia, correct me if I'm wrong, it's only UCL who offers it. It's a postgraduate degree at UCL. That's 1 year and you get paid doing this.
Yes, so what happens is UCL does all the training for the mental health trusts who want psychological well-being practitioners. So when you apply to UCL, you're asked which trusts you might be interested in working for example, in the future, but they're the coordinators and they're the only place that you apply to.
Okay, so thanks, Antonia. Yes, I think I'm not sure where he did his cognitive therapist degree. I would have to ask him that in week 9. I don't recall it from his last talk. I only basically memorized the first stage. But I think if you just Google high intensity therapy certificate, therapist certificate, or cognitive, don't Google cognitive therapist, because that leads you kind of to weird places. It's not a really well protected term, but if you go for high intensity therapist, you will find the right pieces and right information. I can also put that in my next newsletter and kind of share the information. Okay.
If you look at the NHS Careers website, everyone, yes, you can see videos where people talk about being a psychological wellbeing practitioner, and also they will have stuff on there about being the high intensity therapist role. Yes. As Andreas has said, that's usually done after you are the psychological wellbeing practitioner, low intensity therapist. Then you can take on more advanced, yes, more challenging cases.
Yes, very much. I think like one thing that I quite like to use as a research page is also YouTube. There are a lot of people who are basically kind of blogging about their experience, or flogging is I think the right term, about their experience in doing system psychology interviews, about being in a system psychology, being a psychological well-being practitioner, all of these stages, being in a doctorate. And you can see them. I think you always should take it with a grain of salt, because sometimes they have a good or bad experience and they say like, oh, everybody gets in because they got in, or not everybody gets in because they didn't get in. But I think that's a good source to kind of hear a little bit what people are doing. But we will have a lot of people coming in, so I hope this will kind of have that. I think Shama asked a great question. Support learn worker with students who have autism. So this is, I think, just to kind of reiterate, for becoming a clinical or neuroscience psychologist, you can't become directly a neuroscience psychologist. A neurological, you have to first become a clinical educational counseling, or I'm not sure if I know anyone who did forensic and then that. So this is like, if you want to become a clinical psychologist in Shama, yes, that's a great thing to do. It's a great placement to do. Totally agree. Okay, so this is a really good question. Sanab asked a really good question. Oh, sorry, it was a direct message. I hope I didn't reveal too much. So let's say you're in year 2 and you go on a placement for a year. Then sometimes there's like, do I still have to have, for instance, if I want to become a clinical psychologist, I have to have 1 year of work experience after my degree. So it's very explicit that you have to first have the degree and then you have 1 year of work experience. So you can't skip that step, but, and that's why I encourage everyone to take a placement year. If you apply for a system psychology or healthcare support worker, or if you apply for becoming a well-being practitioner, having that placement year is an immense, tremendous advantage, okay? So it's kind of weird. You need basically a year of work experience to get the better work experience. But this is like basically trumps all of other types of volunteering. So it's really, really good to do that. But you still have to do, so I've like one of my students, I say because he's my personal tutee, he is like, he did a placement, he's still like, he's Mohammed Anwar, and he still has to do his 1 year of work experience before he can apply to the doctorate. Okay, Katie is happy with that. Okay, so Tanya, I think we come back next to this, okay? Completely different environment. Yes, we come to this next. This is great. Maybe we can. Okay, so I think like this is something like Megan asked us. I don't actually think it's that hard to get work experience at the moment. I don't know, Megan, maybe you want to share where you tried and didn't get it, because I think most of like of the organizations I'm in contact with, and I know, for instance, that like for placements, it works for like volunteering in certain crisis telephones, Samaritans. I think I know like autism, resources for autism. There are many organizations who still do that. So I think it's really important to still try, and there are many opportunities to get work experience. So what I just kind of perceive from people who ask for reference, from my connections with organizations, I think a lot of them are still offering work experience. So I think then the question, I think, okay, so I'm not sure.
I think just to say quickly, Andreas, some places have definitely reduced their work experience during COVID, but you're quite right. There is still work experience available. For example, Samaritans are not training at the moment.
Yes.
So there's a waiting list. So I'm sure Andreas would encourage you, like me, to join a waiting list for lots of opportunities, go on a waiting list, etc. But some places are still operating. You know, they are still needing people to work as healthcare assistants in mental health trusts. And other places are sort of still offering sort of online services for people with mental health issues, listening services. Even being a befriender in the current crisis is a very useful thing to start having work experience from your CV.
Yes, and I think I'm not sure, like Megan, if we would love to talk more about this and like which organizations, like, because it really depends on the area you're interested in. But if you have no, let's say, I think there are two things. If you have no experience with working with people with mental health, it's very hard to convince somebody that you're really interested in that field, right? I think often people start then you have to start your personal statement by saying, I really care about people who have mental health problems and I'm passionate about helping them. But in the last 3 years, I didn't do anything. So I think if you're a befriender, this is really good. I think like Samaritan is really great. A lot of stuff online or talking to people, crisis telephones are really good if you do something in terms like for mental health. And we come back like to the other ones in a second, because here you talk actually to a person in a crisis. It's like, it's a real experience. I did that and I realized it's not for me. The other thing, it's also important that you kind of see if you like this or not. I work for a crisis service. It wasn't me. I didn't enjoy it very much. So hence I'm here. Okay, could I just kind of like, this sounds all good. I think, Megan, I would love to, maybe you can kind of say a little bit more about the organizations. I would love to learn more about it. Let me kind of, I think Tanya asked that. And this is where we come now to a very different area, okay? We leave a little bit mental health behind us and come to a different area. And that is basically what I call well-being, which I'm not sure if that's the greatest term, but it's just like, I think there's something coherent about this sector. And let me kind of show you what I mean by that. But I think, let me just, I can't close the chat. Yes, I can. Okay, fantastic. So imagine that's like like Benny is back. My imaginary son is back on track and he's doing his work and he feels like, oh, I want to be more productive. I'm in this organization. I want to basically do better. And what he might then engage with is an organizational or occupational psychologist. Okay. So if you don't, like me, if you are more kind of like, let's say you're not so much into clinical psychology, what you're more interested in is social psychology, behavior economics, you're more interested in helping people who not have like obvious issues or mental health concerns or mental health disorders, but you want to help people to flourish, to excel, to be happy in their workplace, then you're perfectly suited to do something as an organizational or occupational occupational psychologist. So we have a master's in organizational psychology. The BPS calls it occupational psychologist, but it's the same. You're basically trying to help people within organizations to flourish. You help them improve their well-being, their productivity, and you're trying to help the organization in general. This is often situated within human resource departments, but if you're a human resource manager, often what you do is you have to allocate vacations and like really boring kind of administrative stuff. And then the interesting stuff within the human resource department, kind of trying to hire people and help them to flourish. That's what an organizational or occupational psychologist does. There's two other minor roles, which I actually don't know much about, I have to say, because they're relatively new and very underexplored. There's health psychologists. You can become a BPS accredited health psychologist, which is like a small area. We have a wonderful, very popular third-year elective by Katie about health psychology, and you can become a sports psychologist. But all of these three, what they have in common is they're BPS accredited careers. What they have in common is that you're trying to help people to basically flourish, okay, to enhance their well-being, to become better at the sports they do, to improve their health or prevent kind of health-related diseases, or to help them in their workplace, okay? So it's very different from what you would do if you would work in these other 5 areas that I just outlined. And then there's like, this is a big break. And this is another area that is loosely, I kind of think of in my head, you can organize around research. So research proper is what I do. You can become a lecturer at the university. Very, very few students choose this career. But I think it's obviously a career. I think it's the best career you can choose, but don't tell anyone else. I love my job and I think it's an amazing job. But then there's a large overlap, for instance, with areas what we often now call behavior economics, or market research, or research in general. So all of these 3 here at the bottom, what they have in common is basically that you use your expertise in psychology and research methods to help mostly organizations, okay? So if you think about the people I know that work, and basically, if I would stop working as a lecturer, I would go to work for one of these market research companies, for instance, Ipsos Mori, which is, I think they're the biggest. We had if you were in my 3rd-year elective, we had a talk by one of them talking about this. This is often kind of applied social psychology. So if you listen to my social psychology lectures, or if you came to my 3rd-year elective on social psychology, and it's like, boah, I would love to do this every day, then this is the area. Behavior economics, so these are people, nudge units, the behavior insight team. All companies now, organizations have often, like the bigger the company, they have their own nudge unit, a unit that tries to use psychological principles to enhance the well-being of their employees, but also to kind of help them sell more, be more productive, okay? So this is very, very different, as you can see from these on the right side, because this is an area that has nothing to do with the BPS. Okay, so on the right side, these 3 are BPS accredited. So if you want to become an occupational psychologist, what you have to do, you obviously have to have a degree in psychology, then you do your master's, then you do your work experience, and this is how you become an occupational psychologist. So often oh no, my cell phone is telling me that my daughter's Zoom class is starting. These are the days. Basically, you would, if you do it, for instance, at City, what you would do is you would do your degree at City. Let me just see. Okay, yes, great question. Okay, I'll answer this question in a second about health psychology. You would first do your master's. And then they would say, okay, these areas, working in these fields, in these areas would qualify you to then become an occupational psychologist. So basically the master's, the BPS accredited master's program in occupational organizational psychology dictate what type of work experience you would have to have in order to then become occupational psychologist. So now it gets a little bit messy, and I have to talk about, like Martha is asking about health psychology. And I think, isn't it my next one, health psychology? Here you have to, Uppsala, yes. Here you actually have, according to the BPS, I don't know much about health psychology, I have to admit, you have to do a master's and a doctorate. I think that at the moment, there's no clear, and Antonia, correct me if I'm wrong, there's no clear path to becoming like there's no job where you apply and work as a health psychologist. You might work in organizations because they feel like we want to have somebody who enhances the physical well-being of our employers. You might work in gyms. You might, I'm not sure. I actually really do not know much about it. And let me write this down. And I will.
Yes, I think it isn't as clear in the sense that there's not a sort of professional doctorate pathway, etc. But most areas of work that people go into are things like smoking cessation, obesity reduction, that kind of thing. So they're involved with maybe local authorities, health teams that are offering paid roles to offer community programs to reduce these things, projects in the community. The NHS also sometimes offer roles, but you won't always find them under health psychologists. They'll have some other term. So it is more difficult to find these opportunities. You have to sort of dig around for them. But it's, as Andreas has said, it's certainly a pathway. But as I say, you can't find these vacancies as easily. You can't just look for the words clinical psychologist or counselling psychologist. You can't just look for health psychologist.
Yes. So I think health psychology is this weird area where you think, if you think about it, it makes so much sense. So many of our problems, ailments are related to our physical health and our behavioral, psychological problems, right? We eat wrongly. We know what we should eat and we don't do it. We don't exercise enough. And we do a lot of other things that kind of impair our physical health. And I feel like many areas of our society could really use more input from health psychology, but there isn't a clear path. I'll talk to Katie Tapper, our resident health psychologist expert, about this. And then I'm not sure. I think we once organized an event like this about health psychology and nobody came. And since then, I'm a little bit like, okay, maybe I just have a chat with Katie about it and record it, and then we can publish that. And then maybe Martha, that helps you.
That sounds a great idea, Andres. But also to say, health psychologists these days are working in the field of pain management, apparently as well. But just look it up, everyone. Just go to the Prospects website, www.prospects.ac.uk, go to the job profile for health psychologists and see what it says about the areas they work in.
Yes, but I think, as you can see, I think it leaves you with the impression it's not as clear, right? There's not, it's a little bit tougher. Okay, this is kind of like a little bit like, I want to, before I jump to the non-BPS accredited stuff, I just want to say, this is the terrible thing they put up on the BPS. And here you can see forensic psychology. You have to have an MSc in forensic psychology, society qualification, or a doctorate. So it seems like there's a path where you can become a forensic psychology just without a doctorate. From my last conversation with a forensic psychologist, he said you have to have a doctorate. Maybe it's more a theoretical thing. But here you can see basically if you have to have like, yeah, what are the pathways for each of them? I think the major ones are outlined, and I think you can trust that, clinical psychology. It's also really, really important to see, look at clinical psychology, right? There's no masters here. Okay, counseling, no master, educational, no master. Okay, so many of these jobs, you don't do a master's, and I recommend against doing a master just for the sake of doing a master. Okay. Here's like, I think something where kind of like, okay, where it becomes, because now we are leaving basically these kind of clear-cut BPS accredited pathways where the path to working there gets a little bit less clear. But if you want to work as a behavior economist, if you're interested in judgment and decision making, if you're interested in nudges, in behavior insights to change people's behavior, there's a huge market out there. It's a huge growth market. It's a lot of really interesting jobs. But basically, at some point, you have to have a master's to do that, and you have to have work experience. But there's never the point where somebody says, oh, we are looking for a behavior economist. This is the job you do. But but a lot of companies do that. And so all of them kind of looking, for instance, the Behavior Insight team, Ipsos Mori, I think, other Vesco, there are other areas where you basically use psychological principles and you draw heavily on your expertise in research in order to kind of help in a certain area. So for instance, if you're working for the Behavior Insight team, they would think like, oh, we need to increase the uptake of vaccines. How can we do that? And then they design interventions and test these interventions of if this actually helps, if we kind of reframe the message a little bit, and that increases the vaccine uptake. So if that's your type of, that's a huge growth market. Citi has a nice, actually, behavior econ masters. Others are out there. Often they're also called behavior change masters. So UCL has a nice one in behavior change, and they basically set you up. A lot of research masters also set you up for that career. I have recorded the first video on should I do a master or not. I interviewed two of my former students, Sophia and Yasmin. They both did a master's at UCL. Both of them are trying to come back, or Yasmin is a PhD student with me right now, and Sophia is on her way to become a PhD student. But they say that everyone who does that basically does something along the lines of behavioral economics, who does not stay in academia. So I think there are many different really good masters out there. That's something. Okay, research lecture, nobody cares about that normally. I think there was, we had one event where we tried how to become a researcher. And I think we had 3 students there and 7 lecturers or something. It was a lovely event. I just want to mention it. This is basically what I did. Mine was a little bit different because I come from a different country, but you basically, if you're in the UK and you want to become a PhD, you do your bachelor, you do your master's, you do a PhD, and then often you have to do a postdoc, after your PhD, and then you become a lecturer. Insanely competitive. Also, how long is the PhD to become a lecturer? The PhD normally is 3 years to become a lecturer in the UK. Other countries have different different lengths. In Germany, most in Europe is 3 years. In the US is 5 to 6 years, but you don't do a master's. So it's a little bit different. It's very much if you're into research. As you can see with all the people who teach you, it's basically a global market. I don't know if the British people might be in a minority on our in our bachelor program, and this is very true for everywhere, because I think academia and science is a very international thing. It's an amazing job. It's insanely competitive to become a lecturer. It might not look like it, but if you have a passion for research, I can only encourage you to do that. Okay. Do you have any questions? I think I saw some in the chat about this. Maybe we just move on, because the last section is very short. And I actually want to close in a minute, but that seems impossible. Let me talk about the other sector. And this is a little bit like where basically what we're trying to do is like, I think there's like, you might finish your degree and feel like, I don't know, psychology wasn't for me. And you are not alone. Okay, you might feel like it was an interesting degree. Really, really hope that you found there was an interesting degree, but you don't want to do anything with that. What can you do? And there are many really interesting jobs where having your psychology degree helps you, but they basically have nothing to do with psychology. Here's just some of the things I have, and here Antonia probably can give you another list of 10 or 20. And but that's basically kind of like teaching. A lot of my former students, some of them have go into teaching. Then civil service, something I absolutely love and recommend. I did a week in investments. I think civil service is one of the greatest jobs you can have in England. It's a meaningful, well-paid, great employer. Check out civil service. They have a graduate fast stream. It's quite competitive, but they also have other careers. Amazing thing to do. If you want to have some meaning in your life and not just money, then this is a fantastic thing to do, civil service. Police. I have one of my students right now. He's going on a graduate program of the police. So you if you're interested in that, then please do that. There's a graduate program that I became aware of prison management. So they look at people who are willing to, who have graduate degrees and want to manage a prison. Looked very interesting, not for me, but you know, I think it's a really cool, it looked really good. And they have like graduate level things. What else? There's a lot of people, when 2 years ago I had an event where I invited alumni who had kind of really different careers. And a lot of them were kind of into user interface, user experience type of work. So basically here, I don't know if you are familiar with these acronyms UI and UX, but basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to, for instance, designing a website, and now somebody with some psychological insight said, oh, this is how we have to structure that website. So A, that the people have the best experience, but B, that we also guide their attention in a way that leads them to the right spot. Okay, so this is something a lot of our alumni actually are doing. Marketing, I hope I have a little interview with one of my former students, Julia, who's currently doing at LSE, a master's in marketing. And my wife, she did a PhD in social psychology. She's now teaching marketing. Marketing is largely applied psychology, applied social psychology. So I think that is something that's also to consider. But the possibilities here are somewhat endless. Okay, let me just kind of see what the questions, maybe I just finish and then I look at the, I think, can I just quickly say something about these 3 pillars, and then maybe we end it there. The 3 pillars for all of these careers is basically you have to have some kind of, you have to have a 2-1 or higher. I think there are ways to get it, but if anyone who's listening here, anyone who's here, please try to get a 2-1, because a lot of these programs have basically as an exclusion 2-2. If you have a 2-2, we can't get you in. And it's taken as basically, if you have a 2-2, you were not motivated during your bachelor degree enough to kind of put in the effort that is needed. And that is not very attractive for a lot of employees. So clinical education and so forth. If you get in your bachelor degree a 2-2, that's there are ways, and you know, like whatever you're like, don't get desperate if this is happening to you, but it's really hard to get a graduate level degree job with a 2-2. So please, 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 if you're still in this program, as I hope you are, try to do a 2-1. And then I think try to get work experience. That's the second one, right? Oh, so, okay, work experience. The one that's often overlooked is try to get a little bit of research experience. If you're a clinical psychologist, what a lot of clinical psychologists, counseling psychologists, educational psychologists, what they struggle with during their doctorate is with the research bit. So a lot of these doctorates explicitly look for people to have research experience because they're afraid that you come in and you can't handle the research bit. So that's like a topic for a different session, but how to get that. But if you see opportunities to get research experience beyond what is part of your degree, that's really, really good. Okay. Let me say one final bit. I think this is one thing I always feel, okay, and I can kind of summarize that a little bit. It's like sometimes students come to me and they say, okay, but clinical psychology is too competitive. I don't want to do it. Or educational psychologist, man, I don't think I can get in there. It's too competitive to get into the doctorate. And I think there are I think that's the wrong way to think about, okay? Anyone who wants to become, really wants to become a clinical psychologist can become a clinical psychologist. I don't think that the competition is that crazy. It might need some persistence and it might need some motivation and ambition, but I think you should go for it. You should go for it and think about the highest possible ambition you can have. And that's what you should shoot for, because this will have many, many positive effects on all of the other areas on your academic, searching work experience, doing research experience. This will really fill up nicely your CV. So I think you should not be discouraged from doing clinical psychology or counseling psychology or any of that. You'll find a way. The other thing is like sometimes people like, oh, I only want to become like help people with mental health problems. I mean, they don't say it like that, but if I can become a clinical psychologist. If you care only about the status or the money, then it will be really hard for you to kind of have the enjoyment and persistent motivation that is needed to get these jobs. Okay, you have to care about something. You have to care about, if, for instance, I think I don't remember who asked about it. I think it was Martha. Yes, Martha asked about health psychology. If you're passionate about health psychology, then you should do something with health psychology, even if the career path is a little bit muddy, because you need that to persist. And if you're passionate about helping people with mental health issues, then you should go for that. Maybe you end up becoming a cognitive therapist or a psychological well-being practitioner, and you might not get into the doctorate right away or later on, but you're in an area that you're passionate and you have a good job. So don't let, I think a lot of people, even like at City, sometimes people say, oh, clinical psychology is too competitive. Don't listen to these people. Don't trust. You can all become clinical psychologists if you want to. It's not that crazy. Okay. Let me go down and see. Okay, so I'm just have to say kind of like, where are you? Okay, a PhD, we answered this. Occupational psychologist, how long do you have to work experience after master? I think you work for 3 years, but I mean, you work and you get money. So you basically, I think it's 3 years. Antonia, I don't know if you know more. I think it's 3 years that you work.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I think you need to check that on the BPS site. I've employed an occupational psychologist before when I was the head of careers, welfare and counselling at a large London college, and he needed to do, he used his experience to get a year's work experience advising students at a college. So I think that's something that needs to be checked. However, if you're interested in it, right now, the Department of Work and Pensions and the Civil Service is advertising for work coaches. And the pay for those, as it's an executive officer role, starts at 27,000. And one of my own politics students has just secured that job. And it's an interesting job if you're interested in working in the community, helping people who are probably unemployed, some of whom might be in quite a bad position, maybe some low qualifications, low self-esteem, or people with quite a lot of ability. You'll receive training, and it would be a very good thing to have on your CV. And you might want to work like that and then apply to do the Masters in Occupational or Organisational Psychology. So getting work experience within the community, building people's skills, helping them compete for jobs is good work experience for that area.
Yeah, for occupational. It's basically if you're some kind of coach, you can also go like and be like a mentor to younger children, like to people who want to get into university is one thing we often work with, like as a charity, and they're trying to help basically be role models and help people, kind of students or pupils who come from non-traditional backgrounds to get into university and teach them some skills in order to get there. So I think that's something is that, you know, let me just kind of, okay. Yes. So,
okay. So the name was DWP, Department for Work and Pensions, part of the Civil Service. If you just type that in, if you just Google it, work coach, DWP, a job description and an application portal will come up straight away. Okay.
So I think there's also something that I want to say. It's like sometimes people say like, oh, what should I do? Should I try to become an assistant psychologist or a psychological well-being practitioner or a mental health support worker? And I think you should try all three, and one of them might work. So don't kind of limit yourself in just one thing. I think, okay, so Emma has a great question. What if you want to, like, what kind of educational psychology work experience? So in general, you have to work within the school system. So that's the first one, to get this context experience. Anything then also that is related to, so for instance, you could do a year of teaching assistant thereafter, after you finish your bachelor degree and then apply. You can also work with, as there are assistant psychologists, as assistant educational psychologists, very thought after. Anything where you work with learning disabilities is great. Anything you work with kind of autism and spectrum disorder is great. So basically working with children who have learning difficulties and or working with children within the school system is really good. It's the same for like when I talked to the forensic psychologist, he said, well, if you want to become a forensic psychologist, you have to have work experience in prison. And even if you worked in the cafeteria, as you have to have that type of basically feeling for the context. That's what they're looking for. And I mean, to a lesser extent, that is also true for education psychology. You want to do something within that context, okay? So I think there's something, so organizational psychologist, you do your master and you're on, I think Sarah is asking that, the job after is, are you guaranteed a job? No, you're not guaranteed a job. I think your chances of finding a job are very good, but I think they're less secure than if you would do clinical or counseling or forensic, or if you do educational psychology. There are many more occupational psychologists, but there are also many more jobs for educational psychologists. So I think nobody guarantees a job. I think probably you mean it more like, is a good chance to find a job, and I think there's a good chance. Yes.
Can I just say, everybody, yes. It's a great career. My family has got a history of learning disabilities, and so we've benefited from the insights of a clinical psychologist. And it's something I would really recommend to people who are interested in working in children, who are interested in working with teenagers, and interested in working in educational or community setting, because you also visit people's homes. You can do work as an educational psychologist visiting people's homes before they get to the school age stage.
So yes, that's a great point. I think there's, Sophia asked about recommendations for how to approach a placement in behavior economics. So behavior economics, I mean, I think you could send me an email and I can send you some stuff. Everyone I know who basically kind of works in like good jobs in like behavior economics at the moment are people who have done like PhDs. So it's like a lot of people who are kind of fed up with academia and said like, okay, I don't want to do this anymore. This is too much work. They leave academia and do kind of behavior economics jobs because the overlap is so strong. Like they're really looking for scientists, but there are, if you're less scientifically oriented, there are, I mean, the ideal job placement would be something within the behavior insight team, right? And behavior insight team, nudge unit like things. You can email me and I can kind of direct you a little bit where to find that. Yes, so research experience or within kind of, yes, nudge units. These are really good kind of places to do behavior economics. There are also a lot of kind of agency. So I work, for instance, with a student, Nicole, and she came back as a part-time master's and she works for a political kind of marketing agency. They work with political parties. They work with, for instance, the UNICEF refugee charity, and they try to use behavioral economics to help, for instance, these charities to get more money so they can channel it to refugees. So I think that's kind of the type of work. But yes, Sophia, please send me an email and I'll put more up on that. I think if I kind of draw this to a close, if you go on the careers, like on Moodle, if you click home, you have the careers module thing. I collect basically everything that comes my way in terms of work experience on these pages. So you will easily find it. And there's a lot of things you can do for each of these areas. Occupational psychology is actually a little bit more difficult. But here often the recommendation is to just do something in an organization. And I'll organize a talk about how to become an organizational psychologist. Let's see if we do it this semester or this term or next term. But yes, I think now that everything is online, things are easier to organize. Okay. If you have any pressing questions, please send me an email. Happy to answer the email. Antonia, thank you so much for joining us. We have next week at 4 p.m. how to become a clinical psychologist. which is basically kind of like deepening the understanding of what I talked about this today. Dr. Amanda Mwali, I hope I pronounced her name correctly. Wonderful speaker, book author, How to Become a Clinical Psychologist. So she has written a book about it. So please don't miss this. And yes, have a wonderful rest week and enjoy your Wednesday afternoon, and talk to you soon.